I don't know why I went alone. It wasn't the plan. I was supposed to go with my brother, but he bailed last minute. Something about work, something about being too tired. I don't know. I should have just stayed home, but I didn't. I told myself it was fine. I wanted the solitude, wanted to clear my head. I thought it would be peaceful. Started off easy. The trail was well marked, winding through thick trees that swayed lazily in the breeze. I liked the sound of the leaves rustling above me, the occasional bird chirping somewhere out of sight. The scent of damp earth and pine needles was sharp in the air. It smelled clean, fresh. I felt good, better than I had in weeks. Work had been eating me alive, stress piling up like a weight on my back. Out here, alone in the woods, I could breathe again. I made good time for the first few miles, stopping only to take a few pictures or sip water. My backpack was heavy, but I liked the weight. It made me feel grounded. The plan was simple: hike up to the ridge, set up camp for the night, and hike back down in the morning. Nothing crazy. I'd done harder trails before. Then, around mile 4, things started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The air seemed thicker, the forest quieter. The kind of quiet that made my skin prickle, like the trees were listening, like something was watching. I shook it off and kept moving. It was probably just my imagination. Being alone does that. Makes you hear things, feel things that aren't there. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. I stopped, staring down at them in the dirt. They were fresh, too fresh. The dirt was still crumbling around the edges, like whoever made them had just passed through. And they weren't boot prints, not hiking shoes. They were bare. A single set of human footprints, barefoot, moving in the same direction I was headed. I swallowed hard and glanced around. Nothing. No one. The woods were still. No sound. No wind. I told myself someone had just been walking barefoot, maybe to feel connected to nature or something. People do weird things. Maybe they were up ahead. Maybe I'd run into them soon, exchange an awkward nod, and move on. But I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. I kept going, slower now, more aware of every sound, every crunch of leaves under my boots. The footprints kept appearing, leading deeper into the woods. Then, after another mile, they just stopped. No turning off the trail. No sign of backtracking. Just gone. I crouched down, staring at the last footprint. The dirt around it was undisturbed, like whoever it was had simply vanished. A snap of a twig somewhere to my left made my heart jump. I whipped my head toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees and shadows stretching between them. I stood up fast, gripping the straps of my backpack. The air felt heavy. Wrong. My stomach tightened. I forced myself to keep walking. Another mile. Then another. I tried to shake it, tried to focus on the trail, on my breathing. But I couldn't. My skin crawled the whole time, the sensation of being watched never leaving me. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, stretching longer than they should in the late afternoon sun. Then I saw something ahead, a backpack, just sitting in the middle of the trail. It wasn't mine. It looked old, dirty, half-zipped open. I stopped a few feet away from it, my pulse hammering. It didn't make sense. No one leaves their pack behind. Not out here. Not unless something was wrong. I took a cautious step closer. The top was unzipped just enough for me to see inside. Clothes, a water bottle, a first aid kit, but no food, no ID, no sign of who it belonged to. Then I noticed the marks in the dirt around it. Scuff marks, drag marks. Something cold settled deep in my stomach. My mouth went dry. I turned and walked fast. Too fast. My legs burned, my lungs strained, but I didn't care. I needed to get away, get out. The forest felt different now, like it was closing in on me. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow made my heart race. I didn't look back. couldn't. The sun dipped lower. The light through the trees turned orange, then red, then a dull gray. I kept moving, pushing through the exhaustion. My camp was still miles away. I didn't care. I wasn't stopping. Then I saw something ahead again. A figure, standing in the middle of the trail, far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't an illusion. Just standing there, not moving. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there. I took a step back. My boot crunched on a twig, the sound too loud in the dead silence. Still, the figure didn't move. I turned and ran. I ran like my life depended on it. My backpack slammed against my back, my feet barely touching the ground. Branches scraped my arms, my legs. My lungs burned. I ran until my vision blurred, until my legs nearly gave out. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, the trail was empty. Nothing behind me, nothing ahead, just trees, just silence. I didn't sleep that night. I found a spot off trail, hidden among thick brush, and sat with my back against a tree, my knife clenched in my shaking hands. I listened, waited. Every sound made my nerves snap like live wires. When the sun finally rose, I was already walking. I didn't stop, didn't rest, just moved, as fast as I could. I made it back to my car just before noon. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking too hard to unlock the door at first. When I finally did, I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked every door. Only when I was speeding down the dirt road, putting miles between me and that forest, did I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I don't know who I saw out there. I don't know what happened to them, or what almost happened to me, but I do know one thing. I will never go hiking alone again. The air was thick and heavy as I pushed deeper into the forest, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The trail had started as a well-maintained path, but after several miles, it had dwindled to little more than a narrow strip of packed dirt, overgrown with tangled roots and creeping vines. It was exactly the kind of hike I had wanted: remote, quiet, and undisturbed. No cell service, no signs of civilization, just the endless stretch of trees and the sound of my boots crunching against loose gravel and fallen leaves. I had planned this trip for weeks, mapping out a loop that would take me through a relatively untouched section of the national forest. 2 days, 1 night. I packed light, just the essentials: food, water, a small tent, a knife, and my trusty headlamp. I wasn't worried about bears. This area wasn't known for them. The biggest danger out here was getting lost, but I had my GPS and a paper map as a backup. I wasn't a rookie. I had done hikes like this before. Around 5 in the evening, I stopped for a break. My legs were starting to ache from the incline, and my shoulders throbbed under the weight of my pack. I leaned against a thick oak tree and pulled out my water bottle, taking slow, measured sips. The silence was almost unnatural. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the faint sound of wind pushing through the treetops. I told myself it was normal. Maybe I was just in a lull, a quiet patch of the woods where animals weren't active. Still, it made my skin crawl. I checked my map, confirming that I had about an hour before I reached the small clearing where I planned to set up camp for the night. I hoisted my pack onto my back and started walking again, picking up my pace to beat the sunset. Then I saw it, a boot print. It was pressed deep into the damp earth at the edge of the trail, half covered by fallen leaves. It was fresh, maybe a day old at most. I frowned, staring at it longer than I needed to. I hadn't seen any other hikers. No tire tracks from mountain bikes, no footprints other than my own. I had specifically chosen this route because it was isolated, but someone had been here, and recently. I shook it off and kept moving. People hiked this forest all the time. It was probably nothing. As I continued forward, the path became rougher. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches reaching overhead, blocking out more and more of the fading light. My GPS beeped a warning, low battery. I pulled it out and saw that it was at 10%. I must have left it on longer than I realized. I cursed under my breath but wasn't too worried. I still had my map and compass. Worst case scenario, I could backtrack to the last marked trailhead. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, dusky blue. I wasted no time setting up camp. My tent was small, just big enough for me to lie down comfortably. I unrolled my sleeping bag, made a quick dinner of protein bars and jerky, and then sat outside for a while, letting the cool night air settle around me. The silence persisted. I had expected the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and distant owl calls, but the forest remained eerily still. My skin prickled as I scanned the darkened tree line. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I didn't linger outside for long. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, my knife within reach, just in case. Sleep came in short bursts. Every little sound yanked me awake. The creak of a tree swaying in the wind, the crunch of leaves shifting underfoot. Around midnight, I heard something new, a low, rhythmic thudding, distant but steady, like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. It was probably an animal, a deer maybe, but something about the pace unsettled me. Too slow, too deliberate. I stayed awake for hours, my ears straining for any sign of movement. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. At dawn, I packed up quickly. My gut told me to keep moving. I wanted to finish the loop and get back to my car before sundown. The sooner I was out of this forest, the better. The hike felt different that morning. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks darker, their shadows stretching too far. I walked fast, checking my map more often than necessary. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I was off course, by at least a mile. I stopped, turning in a slow circle. I should have recognized the landscape, but nothing looked familiar. Just endless trees in every direction. I pulled out my compass and adjusted my heading. If I cut east, I'd intersect with the main trail again. I forced myself to stay calm, even as a cold sweat broke out along my spine. I walked for another hour, then two. The trees never thinned. The landscape never changed. My GPS had died, and my water supply was running low. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. I wasn't just lost. Something was wrong with this place. Then I found the boot print again. The same one I had seen the day before. Same shape, same depth. My breath hitched. That was impossible. I had traveled miles from where I first saw it. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe I had circled back without realizing it. Maybe I had misread my map. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I wasn't alone out here. The realization made my hands tremble. I had to get out. Now, I moved fast, practically jogging through the underbrush. I didn't care about staying on a trail anymore. I just needed to find a road, a landmark, anything that would lead me back to safety. Then I heard it again. The thudding, closer this time. I ran. Branches clawed at my face and arms. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. The sound was behind me now, keeping pace, steady and unhurried, like it knew I had nowhere to go. Then, just as my legs began to give out, I saw it. A break in the trees. A road. I burst through the underbrush, stumbling onto the pavement, gasping for breath. The silence of the forest pressed against my back like a weight. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I walked until I saw a parked ranger truck on the side of the road and collapsed next to it, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The ranger found me an hour later, dehydrated and shaken. He asked if I was lost. I just nodded. I never told him about the footprints or the sound. I just wanted to go home. I had planned the hike for weeks. The trail was deep in the mountains, far from the usual crowded paths. It was a long route, stretching nearly 20 miles through dense forest, across rocky ridges, and down into deep valleys. It wasn't a popular trail, and that was exactly why I wanted to do it. Solitude, fresh air, the challenge. It was just me, my backpack, and the silence of the wild. The forecast was clear, cool during the day, dropping into the 40s at night. Perfect hiking weather. I packed light but smart, enough food for 2 days, a water filter, emergency gear, and a small tent. My boots were broken in, my body was in good shape, and I was ready. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, the ground firm, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds called from the branches, and every now and then, I'd catch the movement of a squirrel or a deer darting through the undergrowth. The quiet was nice, peaceful. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned, giving way to a rocky ridge. The wind picked up, pushing against me, and the trail became narrow. The drop on my right side was steep, hundreds of feet down to jagged rocks. I took my time, watching my step. One wrong move here, and that would be it. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing where I planned to set up camp. The spot was flat, surrounded by trees, with a small stream nearby. Perfect. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and ate a simple meal of jerky and trail mix. The sun dipped behind the mountains, and the temperature dropped quickly. That's when I noticed it. Silence. The forest was always full of noise. Birds, insects, the rustling of small animals. But now nothing, not even the wind. The quiet pressed down on me, thick and unnatural. My skin prickled. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the change in temperature, maybe the way sound carried in the mountains. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I forced myself to go through my usual routine, drinking water, checking my gear, making sure my fire was properly out before crawling into my tent. I lay there, staring at the fabric above me, listening. Still nothing. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Not because of a sound, but because of the lack of one. My breathing was loud in the silence. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Something felt wrong. I stayed still, barely even breathing. Then I heard it. A footstep. Not an animal. Not the wind. A clear, deliberate step on the ground outside my tent. I swallowed hard. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe another hiker? But who would be out here this late, this deep in the mountains? No one else had been on the trail. Another step, closer this time. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My other hand moved slowly to the zipper of my tent. I had to see. I had to know. I pulled it down an inch. Darkness. My fire had burned down to embers. Barely enough light to see more than a few feet. I pushed the tent flap open just enough to peer out. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just trees and shadows. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, knife in hand, watching. But nothing moved. Eventually, exhaustion won. I forced myself to lie back down, knife still in my grip, and I waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, I crawled out of my tent, stiff and tired. I checked the ground around my camp. The dirt was dry, no footprints, but I knew what I heard. I packed up quickly. I was supposed to continue the trail, another day out, but my gut told me to head back. I didn't argue with it. The hike back felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. Every few minutes, I stopped, listening. Halfway back, I found something that made my blood go cold. A shoe. A single, old hiking boot sitting just off the trail. Worn down, covered in dirt. Too small for me. Too clean to have been here long. I stared at it, my heart hammering. My first thought was that someone had lost it. But no one else was out here. I hadn't seen a soul. And something about the way it sat there, upright, almost placed. I didn't wait to think it through. I picked up my pace, practically jogging the last miles back to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking. I never told anyone about that trip. Never went back to that trail. Sometimes late at night, I think about that shoe, about how it got there, about who left it, and about what might have been watching me that night. I had been planning this solo hike for weeks. The weather was just right, cool enough to keep the bugs away, but warm enough that I wouldn't need to pack too many layers. I wanted to test myself, to push my limits and see if I could handle an overnight trek deep into the woods, away from everything and everyone. I picked a trail that wasn't too remote but far enough that I wouldn't run into crowds. It was a lesser-known path in a national forest, about 15 miles out and back. The plan was simple: hike in 10 miles, set up camp, and hike back the next morning. I had my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, the works. I even packed a satellite phone just in case, though I didn't plan on using it. The trail started easy, winding through a thick patch of pine trees. The air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine needles. Birds chirped above, and every now and then, a squirrel darted across the path. It was peaceful. I walked at a steady pace, my boots crunching over the dirt and fallen leaves. The deeper I got into the forest, the quieter it became. Around the 5-mile mark, I stopped for a break. I sat on a fallen log, sipped some water, and ate a granola bar. That's when I noticed how still everything was. The wind had stopped, and the usual rustling of leaves or distant calls of birds were gone. It was just silent. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual quiet you get deep in the woods. I kept moving. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. It wasn't fear, not yet, but an awareness. Like when you think someone is watching you, even though you know you're alone. I forced myself to shake it off. I was probably just paranoid because I wasn't used to being this deep in the wilderness by myself. By the time I hit the 10-mile mark, the sun was starting to dip low. I found a small clearing just off the trail, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and heated up a simple meal, just some rice and beans. As I ate, I noticed the silence again. No crickets, no owls, nothing. I tried not to think about it. I went through my usual routine, cleaned up my cooking area, made sure my food was sealed tight away from any animals, and sat by the fire for a while. The flickering flames cast long shadows around the trees. Then I heard it, a single twig snapping somewhere in the trees. I froze. My mind raced through the possibilities. Deer, maybe a raccoon? I listened for more movement, but there was nothing, just the crackling of my fire. I told myself it was an animal and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every small noise made my heart pound. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before something woke me up. A sound. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It was rhythmic, steady. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. My mind was screaming at me to explain it away. Maybe a deer walking through, maybe the wind shifting branches. But no, these were footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They stopped, right outside my tent. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The fabric of my tent was thin, but I didn't dare unzip it. Whoever or whatever was out there just stood there. No movement, no sound. Minutes passed. My whole body ached from the tension. Then, the footsteps moved again, this time circling my tent, slow and methodical. I reached for my knife, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. My heart hammered in my chest. The footsteps paused again. I thought about making a noise, trying to scare them off, but something told me to stay quiet. Then, finally, the steps retreated. I listened as they faded into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, gripping my knife, eyes locked on the tent's zipper. Every rustling leaf made my skin crawl. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I wasted no time. I packed up as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. The entire hike back, I felt watched. I never saw anyone. No signs of another hiker, no tracks, nothing. But I knew someone had been out there with me. I reached my car just as the sun fully rose. I threw my gear in the trunk and locked the doors the second I got inside. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I never told anyone the full story. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But I know what I heard, and I know I'll never go back to that trail alone again. The sun was barely up when I parked my truck at the trailhead. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I double-checked my pack, water, snacks, first aid kit, flashlight, knife, everything I needed for a day hike. The trail I chose wasn't well known, but that was part of the appeal. Quiet hike, just me and the woods. The first few miles were peaceful. Birds chirped, the occasional squirrel darted across the path, and the wind rustled the treetops. The trail wasn't too steep, but it was rough with loose rocks and exposed roots. I took my time, careful with my footing. I had read that an old, abandoned fire lookout stood somewhere near the summit, and I wanted to see it before heading back down. After a couple of hours, the trees thinned out, giving me glimpses of the valley below. The sky was a perfect blue, the kind that made the world feel open and endless. I took a short break, sipping water and enjoying the view. My phone had no service, which wasn't surprising. I stuffed it back in my pocket and kept moving. About 4 miles in, I noticed the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. I tried to brush it off, but something felt off. I had hiked alone plenty of times, but this was different. The stillness was too complete, like the forest was holding its breath. I pressed on. The trail became narrower, winding through dense undergrowth. The branches seemed to close in, clawing at my sleeves as I passed. I glanced at my GPS watch. I should have been nearing the lookout, but I saw no sign of it. No old fire tower, no clearing, just more trees. The unease settled deeper in my gut. I had followed the trail exactly, but something wasn't right. I checked my watch again. 5 miles in. The lookout should be right here. I scanned my surroundings, turning in a slow circle. Just trees. No old structures, no sign that anyone had been here before me. I pulled out my map, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. Maybe I had missed a turnoff. But as I traced the route with my finger, I realized something strange. The path I had followed didn't match the map. It was close, but not exact. My stomach tightened. Had I taken a wrong turn without noticing? I turned back the way I had come. The air felt heavier now, the silence pressing against my ears, quickened my pace. I wasn't lost, not really. I had just veered off course. I'd get back to the main trail soon. Then I saw it. A footprint. Fresh, but it wasn't mine. My boots had deep treads, a pattern I recognized instantly. This print was different, wider, heavier. And there were more. Several sets. All leading in the same direction I had just come from. My breath came faster. I scanned the trees, suddenly feeling exposed. I had seen no one else all day. No distant voices, no rustling brush to signal another hiker's presence. And yet, these prints were fresh. I needed to get back to my truck. Now, I picked up my pace, moving quickly but carefully. The uneven ground threatened to trip me with every step. My pack felt heavier, my breathing too loud in the unnatural quiet. Then, the forest opened up into a small clearing. I stopped cold. A campsite, but not a normal one. There was no tent, no fire ring, just scattered gear, dirty blankets, empty cans, a torn backpack. It looked abandoned, but not for long. A makeshift shelter of branches and tarp sagged against a tree. Something about it felt wrong. I didn't want to be here. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I turned back to the trail, walking fast, my muscles tight with tension. And then I heard it dot a rustling. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I forced myself to move faster, fighting the urge to break into a sprint. Running would make noise. Running would give away that I knew I wasn't alone. The sound of movement behind me was steady. Too steady. Whoever was there wasn't trying to catch up. They were following. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. My knife was in my pack, useless there. My only option was to get back to my truck. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving at a controlled pace. I had to be close to the trailhead now. I had to be. Then, just ahead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A second set of footprints, coming from a different direction, meeting mine. I wasn't just being followed. Someone was waiting for me. I veered off the path, stepping carefully, quietly. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I moved behind a thick tree, pressing my back against the rough bark. I listened. The footsteps continued on the trail. Slow, deliberate. They passed me. I held my breath. Then they stopped. I stayed still, barely daring to exhale. The seconds dragged on. Then, without warning, the footsteps started again, this time moving faster, running toward my truck. I broke into a sprint, weaving through the trees, taking a direct route down the slope. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. Branches whipped at my arms and face, the ground uneven beneath me. I stumbled, caught myself, kept going. Then, finally, the trees thinned. The trailhead parking lot came into view. My truck, and a man. He was halfway to my driver's side door when he saw me. He froze, and for a split second, we locked eyes. He was dirty, ragged, his clothes torn, his face hollow. Then he turned and ran, disappearing into the woods on the other side of the lot. I didn't stop moving until I was in my truck with the doors locked. My hands shook as I started the engine, my breath ragged. I didn't look back as I peeled out of the lot, gravel spitting beneath my tires. I drove until I reached the nearest town, pulled into a gas station, and just sat there, hands gripping the wheel. My body ached, my mind raced. I never saw him again. I never went back to that trail. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to find that campsite, and I wasn't supposed to leave. The sun hung low in the sky when I set out, the warm glow of late afternoon filtering through the dense tree line ahead. The trailhead was quiet, just the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls filling the stillness. I had picked this hike because it was supposed to be isolated. No tourists, no chatter, just miles of wilderness. I carried everything I needed, plenty of water, a knife, a lighter, a first aid kit, and my GPS. The hike was supposed to take me deep into the forest, following a narrow, winding path that few people traveled. My goal was to reach a small clearing about 8 miles in, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars before heading back in the morning. It sounded simple. It should have been simple. The first few miles were peaceful. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the crunch of my boots against the dirt path was the only sound accompanying me. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds became less frequent. The wind didn't seem to reach this far into the trees. Even my own footsteps started to sound muffled. At around the 5-mile mark, I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been well maintained at the start, was becoming less defined. Grass and weeds crept over the path as if no one had walked this way in years. My GPS reassured me I was still on course, but the feeling of isolation was growing. I couldn't shake the sense that I was the only person who had been through here in a very long time. A few minutes later, I saw something odd, an old backpack sitting just off the path. It was faded and weather-worn, the zippers rusted and the fabric torn in places. It looked like it had been there for a while. I nudged it with my boot, and a small cloud of dirt puffed up around it. Against my better judgment, I unzipped it. Inside, there were some old supplies, a rusted multi-tool, an empty water bottle, a torn jacket. But what made my stomach tighten was the notebook. It was soaked from rain and covered in dirt, but some pages were still legible. The first few entries were normal, talking about the hike, describing the trees and wildlife. But as I flipped further, the handwriting became rushed, frantic. I keep hearing something in the trees. It's not an animal. Footsteps, always behind me, never ahead. It won't let me leave. The last entry was smeared with dirt and nearly impossible to read, but I could make out a few words. No way out. Still watching. I closed the notebook and shoved it back in the backpack. A cold sweat ran down my spine. It was probably a joke. Someone messing around, trying to scare people. But why had the bag been abandoned? And where was the person who left it? I kept moving. The trail was getting harder to follow, but I didn't want to turn back. I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what being alone in the woods does to you. It makes you start seeing things that aren't there. Another mile in, I noticed the silence again. No birds, no insects. Just my own breathing and the sound of my boots against the dirt. Then I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't the soft, natural sound of a branch breaking from age. This was sharp, deliberate, like someone had stepped on it. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, just dense forest stretching back the way I came. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but my gut was telling me something different. I started walking faster, checking my GPS more often. I had 3 miles left until the clearing. If I could make it there, I could build a fire, calm my nerves, and get some sleep. Then I could leave at first light. That was the plan. But the feeling didn't go away. Every few minutes, I would hear another sound. A footstep, a rustle, the quick snap of a twig. Always behind me, never ahead. At one point, I turned quickly, hoping to catch whatever was off guard. But there was nothing there. Just trees, just silence. I pushed on. The last mile to the clearing felt like it took an eternity. My hands were shaking as I set up my tent. I built a fire as fast as I could, the flickering flames casting long shadows around the trees. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food. Every so often, I would turn my head sharply, convinced I'd see someone standing just at the edge of the firelight. But there was never anything there. I told myself I was being stupid, that I was tired, that the mind plays tricks in the dark. But I kept my knife in my hand as I crawled into my tent. I left the fire burning. I lay there for hours listening, waiting. Every sound outside made my heart pound. The wind picked up at some point, and I told myself that was what I had been hearing before. Just the wind, just the trees shifting. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Then I woke up, not to a sound, not to movement, but to the feeling that something was wrong. The fire was out, the air was still, and my tent was open. The zipper, which I had closed all the way before bed, was halfway down. I stared at it, my breath frozen in my throat. I hadn't done that. I knew I hadn't done that. I reached for my knife with a shaking hand, listening so hard my ears hurt. There was nothing, just the dark, just the feeling that I was not alone. I stayed like that until the first light of dawn. The second the sun started creeping through the trees, I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just ran. I ran the entire way back, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The whole time, I felt like something was just behind me, just out of sight. But I never looked back. I reached my car just as the sun fully rose. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove without stopping. I didn't even let myself breathe until I was miles away. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trek through a remote stretch of forest in the Pacific Northwest. No established trails, just raw wilderness. I had all the essentials: a satellite phone, GPS, compass, a reliable map, extra food, water, and my knife. I wasn't inexperienced either. I had been hiking since I was a teenager, and I knew how to handle myself out there. But looking back, I should have known something was off from the start. The first day was uneventful. The forest was thick, the air damp, the scent of pine and moss filling my lungs with every breath. The ground was soft, covered in years of fallen needles and decaying wood. I kept a steady pace, occasionally marking my route with small notches on trees to ensure I could backtrack if necessary. My plan was to reach a small lake that was roughly 20 miles in. I'd camp there for the night, enjoy the solitude, and continue deeper the next day. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something that made me pause. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you hear birds, the rustling of small animals, the distant knocking of a woodpecker. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the undergrowth. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to my imagination. I reached the lake just before sunset. The water was still, a perfect reflection of the sky above. I set up my tent a few feet from the shore, made a small fire, and boiled some water for my freeze-dried meal. As I ate, I kept glancing at the trees. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I've been alone in the wilderness plenty of times, but this felt different. Something was wrong. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and forced myself to relax. That night, I woke up to a sound, a sharp snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I lay still, listening. Then came another, closer. My hand went to my knife, my heart hammering in my chest. Could have been a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I stayed awake for the next few hours, my knife in my grip, listening. But there was nothing more. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I packed up and moved out quickly. The uneasy feeling hadn't left me. I decided to push forward rather than turn back, hoping it was just nerves. The deeper I went into the forest, the stranger things became. I started noticing odd patterns in the trees, twisted trunks, deep gashes in the bark that didn't look natural. At one point, I came across a small clearing with rocks arranged in a perfect circle. They weren't just scattered there, they had been placed. It was deliberate. I didn't stay long. By late afternoon, I realized I had gone off course. My GPS was acting strange, my compass spinning inconsistently. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. I knew I wasn't lost. Not yet, but I was frustrated. I decided to set up camp early and reorient myself in the morning. That night was worse. I woke up to movement outside my tent. It was slow, deliberate. Not the quick rustling of an animal, but something heavy. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tightly my fingers ached. The sound moved around my tent, stopping just outside the entrance. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, human. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours, but must have been minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I didn't move until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent, my stomach dropped. Footprints, bare human footprints, circled my tent. The prints were fresh, the toes pressed deep into the damp soil. My gut told me to leave, to turn back the way I came. But I didn't know which way that was anymore. My GPS was useless, my compass unreliable. I was well and truly lost. I walked all day, trying to find anything familiar, but the deeper I went, the worse it got. I found more of those strange rock formations, more trees with unnatural marks. At one point, I came across a pile of bones. Small ones, maybe from a deer, but they were arranged in a spiral pattern. Something was wrong with this place. As night fell, I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't want to camp again. I kept my knife in my hand, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out. My legs ached, my body exhausted, but I pressed on. Then I heard it again, footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were ahead. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming closer. I turned off my flashlight and crouched low, trying to steady my shaking hands. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, getting closer with every second. I could hear breathing again, shallow, ragged. It wasn't an animal. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it. Something was there. And then, just like before, the sound stopped. Silence swallowed the forest. I stayed like that, crouched and frozen, for what felt like an eternity. When I finally forced myself to move, my legs screamed in protest. I walked until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I saw something that nearly made me collapse from relief. A trail. A real man-made trail. I followed it, moving as fast as my aching body allowed. After a few miles, I saw signs, the kind with maps and trail markers. I wasn't far from a ranger station. When I finally stumbled into the station, the ranger looked at me like I was a ghost. I must have looked like one, filthy, exhausted, shaking. I told him I had gotten lost off trail, but I didn't mention the footprints. I didn't mention the sounds. I just wanted to get out of there. I don't know what was in those woods. I don't think I want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go hiking alone again.